Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Visions of Good Education. I am honored and privileged to have with us today Dr. David Stovall, who is going to talk about a number of different topics related to education. He's extremely widely published, and he has spoken at a myriad of different places and is doing a number of incredible work. So I'll kind of invite him to tell us to talk about it. So, Dr. Stovall, can you talk about your background in K-12 education, which would include, and I think because your story is unique, that as a student and now as an educator?
Yeah, definitely. Again, thanks so much for having me on. I think the best place to start was me in high school. So something that I talk about often, I actually found my critical consciousness through my peers. So I actually went to a school that was a predominantly Black, about 70% Black, about 30% white, parochial school here in Chicago. And one of my classmates actually leaned over to me in chemistry class and said, "Look, this is not it." And then he said, "All right, and then I said, okay, I agree with him and said, look, I agree wholeheartedly that this is trash happening right now." So he actually gave me the selected speeches of Malcolm X. And I just started devouring it in class. So I'm reading Message to the Grassroots, Ballad of the Bullet. So that actually sparked my interest. And it actually made me think about my grandmother, who always had books of history in her house. And it was me making the connection. So I also had some history books in my own house. So it was just making, and ironically, all of them were written from a critical perspective. I mean, my grandmother had books by Herbert Aptheker, right? So this critical historian who actually engaged in this way. So my senior year in high school, I actually had a classmate of mine say, "Look, you like to run your mouth a lot. We should have a Black Studies class here in school." And I said, "Okay, cool." So that propelled me into working with her to develop a Black Studies class, and a Black Studies class that I did not take, right? So it was my senior year. It was setting it up for sophomores and juniors who came up behind me. So that, to me, gave me a sense of doing stuff that I may not see, but will be beneficial. So in thinking about that, as I got into college, I started to look at what was happening in the world and how it was affecting me, right? How it was affecting my community, how it was affecting Black people in general, people of color in general. And one of the things that came out in that space in terms of really looking at that time, so we're talking about the early 90s, and this is kind of the back end or the middle of the war on drugs. So I'm seeing a lot of my friends who I grew up with getting inordinate sentences for petty possession. Some were trafficking sentences. So in seeing that, really making a connection to what this was about in terms of how people have been deemed disposable and then how other people have been deemed valuable. And often that's along the lines of race, class, gender, age, ability, sexual orientation, and differentiating abilities, right? So looking at those spaces. And then when I got to grad school, I got introduced to CRT, and it was this thing around, more so than critical race theory is saying racism is endemic to life in the United States. The other thing, there's a subset of CRT that I was drawn to called critical race praxis. And the tenet that I feel is the most important, and it says that we need to spend less time with abstract theorizing and more time on the ground with people experiencing injustice, because at any given moment, it could be us, right? So this thing around really having an understanding that no matter how much quote unquote formal educational attainment you have, you could still be entrapped in a system that has deemed you criminal before human, right? So if in me thinking about that, the question I began to ask, well, where can I do the type of work that is connected to this understanding that is also connected to shifting conditions? So even though I've spent quite a few years in K-12 spaces, I don't have a traditional teaching certificate, right? So I actually got to schools by way of community organizations. So I actually was working in a tutoring program. Then that became part of a history project. Then there was another program that I was working in that was a reading project with fifth graders. And then the teacher liked my interaction with the students. So then I actually started working with her in her classroom. So those spaces, so I don't have the traditional route of going through a college of education and then going through a teacher certification program. So when I got back to Chicago from graduate school, a couple of friends of mine who were community organizers were telling me about something that was happening in the community around a demand on public education. Mm-hmm. So that amassed itself into a hunger strike. So that hunger strike lasted for 19 days. 14 people went for 19 days in that hunger strike. So that space, they called me in to say, hey, look, we know some of the work that you're doing. And at the time, I worked with another friend who actually was doing a program called City is Classroom, where it was young people from a number of different high schools who were taking classes in different areas around the city. And one of the places where they would take class would actually be with me, with my college students. So while I was doing that work, I had known about what was happening with the hunger strike, and I knew two of the hunger strikers. So they called me in and they said, look, this is what's happening. This is what we're trying to do. Will you work with us as this stuff moves forward? So that's how I became a member of the design team. That's how I became one of the folks who wrote the proposal for the school. And then in the proposal, we wrote, myself and another colleague, Rico Gutstein, we wrote that we would actually teach at the school. So, and what we did, we got them duly enrolled. We got our students duly enrolled and then gave them college credit, but we actually taught the class on the campus. So that's kind of my trajectory in working in school space, but that has always been connected to how we understand housing, how we understand law enforcement, and how we understand the positioning of schools, and more importantly, resistance and struggles towards liberation.
Yeah, I think what's really important there, and I wonder if you feel this way, just because you have that outside, you didn't get sort of brought up in this system to get into the system's thinking. It really, in many ways, it seems as an advantage to you, because you didn't go through the traditional route of teaching, that you had a different perspective that you could bring to the table, along with seeing the broader picture of how all of these different entities sort of fit together in creating this situation we find ourselves in, this system. So I appreciate that. Along the same lines, and I'm excited to hear where you go with this question. We know that there are a number of problems in the educational system. You're seeing them on the ground floor. You have said that you felt that you had to change the educational system's flaw from the inside, but what do you think about, or what do you believe about how we can go about really making systemic change, or change at all?
Right, definitely. Thank you for that question. And let me be clear. I'm not an advocate for the inside route in terms of changing school systems, right? I think it's important to state that we have to think about the myriad of spaces. So inside is one position. And if you do, in fact, I would argue that if you do not have an external component to what you're doing on the inside, then it can be a fail complete. And I think this is important to state, because a lot of times people feel that the mechanism of using the inside is the way to actually bring for change. And I think right now, what folks who are talking, people who are talking about abolition, people who are talking about fugitivity, it's this understanding that reform is not enough, right? It's not enough. I mean, it's not, I mean, the vision I always put onto people is like, look, if you put a pink bow on a putrid turd, it's still a piece of shit, right? So this thing around, we have to think about what that means. So now, what's the process that you're going to do to put the piece of shit in a toilet and flush it, right? And now come up with something new. And I think this becomes important. So now, when we think about teacher training programs, administrative training programs, what does it mean to train them fugitively? And this is what I mean by fugitively, to say, look, the expectation can never be that a system rooted in white supremacy will do right by the people that it has determined to be disposable, right? It's just structurally that won't happen. So now, if there are people inside of that thing, what are they doing to build critical consciousness to now say that this practice has to end? And now where are we pulling from the outside to bring in those perspectives? So it's not this idea, because the understanding is systems are never created to destroy themselves, right? Systems are created to perpetuate themselves. So now if we know that US schooling is deeply ensconced in white supremacy in terms of its curriculum and pedagogy, right, now what are we willing to do, right? So one site of struggle could be the schoolhouse, but another site of struggle could be building your own school. Another site of struggle could be making sure that you're making the connection between schools and gentrification by looking at housing. Another connection could be thinking about schoolhouses as community centers, right? So this idea of operating fugitively is first saying the rules here don't work. So what am I willing to do to say, because those rules don't work, I'm prepared for authority to come at me when it is interpreted that I have broken those rules, right? Because they're going to come, right? As soon as you have made an understanding and have made a determination around justice, the authorities that are trying to perpetuate themselves are going to come, right? So now you have to be prepared for when they come. And more importantly, externally, you will need those folks to support you, right? Because solely an internal strategy is never enough, and it will not work, right? So this thing around, now we have to think about, if we're thinking about this thing fugitively, it's saying there are all these spaces that now impact us, and what are we willing to do to shift and get our needs met? And that's a different space, because I've even written about this and say, abolitionists have a point, right? This idea of these things that have perpetually dehumanized you no longer need to exist. So now, if we know that they no longer need to exist, what do we need to do to build anew, right? And I think that's an important question that abolitionists put to us, and one that I have embraced in my own work in trying to do this and look at this. So what does school abolition mean when we think about schooling is very different from education, right? Schooling is the order and compliance sanctioned by the state, largely rooted in white supremacy. Education is the process where you ask questions of that thing that is dehumanizing you and making an attempt to destroy that thing and build something different. Because I think a lot of times, we live in such a polarized society. The other thing around abolition is saying we must be in the practice of building a new world, right? Mm-hmm. And I think and how do we actually, so if that's our practice, what does that look like in classrooms? What does that look like when we're talking with community members? What does that look like if we're working with different formations and organizations who are trying to get their needs met around housing, healthcare, employment, and education? So thinking about that in that particular way. So I'm always thinking about, what is education connected to? And then when we actually figure out what it's connected to, now we can figure out the path forward.
And I think that's so important for educators to hear, because they often feel as though there's pressure on them to fix the system that currently exists, that they're in a silo by themselves, and somehow the weight of the world is on their shoulders. And I think it's refreshing to hear you talk about how it's a much broader issue than that. Connections need to be made. A lot more needs to happen. And I think the other piece is, I was thinking about in business, they talk about when products can evolve, or sometimes there's a disruption, where something like when the iPhone came out, that was a disruption. It was just like nothing else. And I think that's kind of what I'm hearing you say about what you see as what we need to do in education if we really want to make the change. Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. So I'm going to shift gears just slightly.
Mm-hmm.
Lately, I have been hearing a lot of discussion, and I've been reading a lot about this notion of neoliberalism. And you and others have written that neoliberalism is a pressing issue impacting public schools. I think it seems to me in my interactions that we have a definitional problem that people don't know what they're talking about when they talk about neoliberalism.
Yes.
And I've read what you've written about it, and I really appreciate it. So I wondered if you could define for our audience how you conceive of neoliberalism, and maybe explain a little bit about how it's impacting schools, public schools.
Right. Yeah, and thank you for that. And let me shout out Pauline Littman, because when I was first becoming abreast to the term, I was always like, wait, this is, because I kept confusing liberalism and neo, right? So I'm thinking like, what is this, the new liberalism? What are we talking about, right? So, but Pauline broke it down, and she broke it down by actually introducing me to the work of David Harvey, right? And for folks who want to check him out, he has an excellent book, very clear, called A Brief History of Neoliberalism. And what neoliberalism, the idea is the privatization of public goods, right? So if we think about that in the forefront, right? So the things that have been part of the public commons, whether it be education, whether it be parking meters, whether it be toll roads, whether it be streets and sanitation, the idea, and it's an idea around Milton Friedman, right? This idea that markets will solve social problems. And because markets are viewed as the solution to social problems, we need to free those markets to now have complete reign over those things that were once public. So for example, when instead of thinking about neoliberalism as this new liberalism, a good friend of mine, Cedric Johnson, always says, we need to think about the liberalism as the liberation of markets, right? The deregulation of markets. So now school is thought of as a market, no longer a public good. And the best way to engage that is with people who feel as if they can sell a product to families because the existing thing hasn't worked, right? So it's a market analysis of public goods. So the free market can do better than the public because it is committed to the development of product. Now, the problem comes in, especially with schools. Neoliberalism is based around efficiency. We know that good teaching and effective learning isn't efficient. You can't do the same thing with different students and expect similar results, right? So because every student is different, we have to think about education as effective, and effective may not be efficient in the sense of the market, right? So that's the first departure from neoliberalism. The other thing around neoliberalism that's important is the idea of the sanctity of the individual. So this originates with Thatcher and Reagan in the early 80s, where Thatcher says there's no such thing as society, right? So there's no such thing as collective need, right? It's only the individual. So now when we hear about neoliberalism, the operative word is choice, right? And if you have not made a right choice, then it is your fault. Irregardless of disinvestment, irregardless of white supremacy, irregardless of the police state, irregardless of the removal of resources from particular communities, it's your fault because you made a bad choice. And now this is starting to backfire because we're seeing this with charter schools where they advertise to parents and say, look, you've had 40 years of shit. Here's this new thing. We don't know what it is, but it can't be worse than what you already have. And then when parents send their kids to these spaces, they have these draconian discipline policies. They don't let you speak your home language. They have all of these things around punitive discipline. And still the idea is this is all about you making the right choice. But what's missing from the analysis is we haven't looked at, well, what are we choosing from? And then when we choose, why are we still demeaned in these places? So I think going back, when we think about neoliberalism, thinking about the freeing of markets, the sanctity of the individual, and the privatization of public goods.
That's a great answer. Thank you. I hope that offers clarity, because I just think the way that you explain it makes it so clear exactly what it is that we're talking about. So I appreciate you sharing that. Going down this road just a little bit further, you've written and talked about how standardized testing continues to perpetuate the political, social, economic, and educational inequities and throughout the K-20 education system. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that and why you feel that way?
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, when I was in the College of Education, my office was 3 doors down from a measurement statistician, right? So he was an educational psychologist. And he would always make this point. He was like, look, testing we have to understand testing, going back to neoliberalism, as a market. It's not really telling us anything about the aptitude or any predictive measure around student success, right? We know this. I mean, so psychometricians who write tests, they know this, right? So the idea of this thing being the sole determinant as to whether schools get funding, whether funding gets taken away, is absurd, because the best thing a test will test is how well you take that test at a certain point of the day. I mean, this is basic psychometrics, right? So, all the folks who do psychometricians who write tests, they say this all the time. So the idea is that someone has cornered this market and now has sold this idea to districts that these tests are the sign of performance. And we know that they're not, right? Your ability to quote unquote succeed on these tests are much more equated to family income than your ability to actually engage complex issues and concerns and analyze and actually produce understandings of those complex issues and concerns, right? So there's a fundamental problem with testing. And then we have to think about the history of testing and its connection to eugenics, right? So Tukufu Zuberi writes an excellent book called Thicker Than Blood. And then before that, you had the mismeasure of man, right? So this idea around IQ, this idea around SATs or the ACT, this is all based in a belief in the ineptitude of people of color to actually determine their conditions and to work to change them, right? So this thing is actually based in its genesis, is based in a pseudoscience, right? That was based in the intellectual inferiority of Black people and other people of color, right? So this thing around, so now why would we expect it to be any different, right, from its origin, right? And we see, and we're in this really interesting moment, because now a lot of colleges have said, look, this thing isn't really telling us too much. So let's go ahead and scrap it. And we have a whole different admissions process. So I think these things need to be brought into our conversation, because the origin story tells us a different positioning, right? And I think the issue is often, because in the United States, we're so ahistorical, right? History was 15 minutes ago in the United States, right? So when you bring up history, now it's an affront to people, right? Why are you bringing this up? Like, look, this is the point, right? So if we're not able to talk about the point, then all of these things around measurement aren't going to make any sense, right? And now people are actually calling that into the discussion and saying, look, this doesn't make any sense. And what we really need to think about is more authentic forms of assessment that let us know where our young folks may have some challenges, and then what our young folks know very well and how we can expound on what they know very well.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate the concrete of this is what it would look like, and getting at, and I think what people really don't get, and I think you hit it, is they don't realize the inherent limitations of these tests, because they only measure, like I always think of Bloom's taxonomy, right? They can only get to the lowest levels of processing. They can't get to creativity. And frankly, the biggest irony is we keep talking about 21st century skills, right? Collaboration and creative problem solving.
Exactly.
It's none of that.
Exactly.
It has nothing to do
Exactly.
with this. It's just absurd.
Exactly.
So I really appreciate your perspective. So I'm going to go to ask about equity and where we are now. For many people, and specifically for teachers, I've talked to a lot of teachers and who deeply believe in equity and social justice and inclusion. But I hear a lot of them, and part of it's the pandemic, part of it's, you know, all that's gone on in race relations from Breonna Taylor on down the line. They're feeling beat up, and they're feeling like it's just too big. I can't do this. What am I supposed to do? But you have this incredible passion and energy and like this desire that just won't quit, that you are going to continue to do everything to make an impact that you got. So I'm really interested to hear what you might say to teachers or students or administrators and any school professionals who deeply desire to make change, but feel just overwhelmed and defeated.
Yeah. And thank you for that, because I think, you know, I'm feeling that a little bit of that myself. Right. And I think it's important to state, it's like, look, nothing is good right now. Right. And I think it's important to have that conversation and not to be Chicken Little, right? But this idea of saying we are in a moment of extreme challenge when you think about education, right? So that, and because much of this kind of virtual space is antithetical to what we know is conducive to learning, right? To your earlier point, right? Being in community with folks, being able to have multiple sets of discussions in the same place, being able to pull those discussions together, to develop projects, right? So our work is developed when we are in community with each other, right? So organizing mantra is always, and I always think about it in terms of education space, the plan emerges when we commit to be together. Right. So now, because we're so fractured in terms of not being able to be together, that makes it really tough. And for all the teachers who are listening, for all the teachers who are still engaging with young folks and families, you know, it's important to state that this time is exceptionally tough, and we need to recognize that, right? And we need to offer some grace in that understanding. And at the same time, we should now think about something else, right? So this COVID moment has just intensified what we've always known with schooling, right? And I'm making that difference between schooling and education, right? So this moment is so now these inequities shine brighter, right? They are more pronounced, right? Because now we have a real access issue, right? So here in Chicago, this past March when COVID hit, before COVID, 60% of students in Chicago public schools access the internet, not by a computer or a tablet, but by their phones, right? So so if we think about that, right? And then post-COVID, you had almost 40% of the population that never logged in once, right? So this thing around, when we think about that, right? And now these access, and you know, teachers who are in this, right? Because I don't want to think about this external, but like teachers who are in this, right? And it's not the fault of the students that they don't have access. So now we have to ask these questions when we think about equity. What does that really mean when we are challenged in looking at these disparities, right? And who has access, and then what will be afforded to them, right? So this thing around really thinking about that. But I think to teachers, the recognition that this moment is tough, right? And a whole lot does not look good right now. And that's why it becomes all the more important to keep in contact with the communities that we have, right? So the spaces that have been supportive of us, now we got to go into them even deeper, even if we can't necessarily see them or be in physical space with them, right? I think this type of work really becomes important. And it's a difficult moment right now. And I think I really appreciate your question, because we're not saying it, right? We're not giving teachers credit and saying like, no, it's shit is real right now. And if we don't take into context what that means, then we're constantly going to be throwing a blame around when there's some things that pre-COVID have now just been exacerbated, right? I think that's the thing around the COVID moment, right? The COVID moment has alerted a large population of people in the United States of what many Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color have known for time immemorial, right? So now it's like, look, we told y'all, now we're in it. What are we willing to do, understanding that we're in it? So equity is still about getting people what they need when they need it, because they need it, right? So I think and it's tougher to do now because we're distanced from each other, right? In physical space. And it makes it harder to collaborate. It makes it harder to do our work when there were already challenges existing. So I think it's important to understand that and then really put our heads together around creating community in this moment, because the support is now even more important to keep folks' energies high, to keep their willingness to engage.
I love that answer. Thank you so much for that. I keep telling folks, our moment is now. A lot of us, for some people, all this stuff is new. Like, wait a minute, inequities. What do you mean? And for a lot of us who either lived it or, like myself, I worked as a teacher in Title I schools for like my whole career, right? This is not new. I've been banging this drum for a while, and people are like, what are you talking about? They can't say, what are you talking about anymore? It's right in front of their face. So for me, I think it's an opportunity. People have awoken to what the heck is going on here right now. And we can build a coalition and that of people who otherwise might not have been paying attention. So I just think it's an opportunity for all of us. And we're in this together. Like you said, that community piece, like to keep lifting each other up. And I love that you said grace. We got to give each other grace. I keep saying that to my students. I believe that so deeply. Thank you. That was such an awesome answer. So our last question, I'm going to go sort of totally in another direction, Anya. So you're a person who lives with purpose. And I say that about people who, like, you can tell, like, with your passion and just in just your tunnel focus of what you're doing and how deeply you believe in it. That can be tiresome sometimes. I know I'm someone who lives a purpose. What gets David Stovall up in the morning? What do you look forward to, and what gives you that purpose?
Well, the thing that I look forward to is the capacity to build with others, right? To build with others to address these issues and concerns, right? Whether it be white supremacy, whether it be white supremacy in the form of inadequate schooling systems, housing, education, healthcare. And in the same time, and I say this as somebody who's kind of evolved to this, and I'm very thankful for my partner who actually put me onto this, because I was engaged in a space where I was essentially slowly killing myself, right? In terms of not paying attention to my health and wellness and just thinking that everything was about the work. And if you do that, your life is unfortunately ends prematurely, right? So now it's really around thinking about what is harmonious, right? And understanding that we have to build capacity in ourselves to fight, but also we also have to give some care to prepare ourselves for that fight, right? So I think that's a different thing. That's something I had to come to, right? And I resisted it quite a bit, right? What do you mean, love? This shit is struggle. Like what are we talking about, right? So, and that thing around really operating from a space of love actually shifts how I think about the work in terms of what gets me up. It's like, look, this new day is a reminder of what it is that you have come to do. Who will you do it with? How will you do it? And then what are you willing to share when others approach you about doing similar things, right? So for me, that's always the motivation, because a lot of times, I mean, I've been, this COVID moment has made a lot of folks tired very quickly. And now we got to think about, what rejuvenates us, right? And at a very simple level, right? So if we think about our nutrition, if we think about our exercise, if we think about how we engage with other folks, right? How do we check in with other folks? How do we hold uh, other folks? And then give ourselves some grace, right? And which to me over the years was often a hard thing to do, right? Because, you know, you're so down on yourself when you feel that you messed up. But now it's this thing around recovery, right? And healing is just as important as the struggle, right? In fact, our struggle needs to include recovery and healing, right? Because many of us are unable to recover because of the pressures of white supremacy, capitalism, and the COVID moment, right? So now when we think about existing under those three pandemics of white supremacy, capitalism, and the whole health pandemic of COVID, now how do we take a couple of steps into ourselves to say, okay, here's how I can best do my work and maintain a modicum of wellness. And that's I'll be completely honest, that's tougher work. It's different work. And that's my motivation around, I know that I am not by myself, but also understanding that there's real work that we have to do.
But I think what your message is, and every single reader, listener needs to hear that, is you got to take care of you before you can really be the best you to make the difference that you want to be. So I appreciate that advice, and I hope all our listeners heed your advice, because I think it's tremendously important. Dr. Stovall, it has been nothing short of a pleasure and an honor speaking to you. Thank you so much. Everyone, check out down below in the blog post links to all the incredible things that Dr. Stovall is doing. And thank you, and be well.
Yeah, definitely, man. Thanks so much.
All right.